In this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can prepare for your interviews that you'll need to conduct in order to get more information for your feature article assignment that's coming up here in about a week and a half, 2 weeks. And then after that, I will talk about how do we engage in descriptive writing for a feature, because that is one of the aspects of writing that makes it a little more different than what we might find in traditional news articles and press releases. So as you guys are thinking about the sources that you want to reach out to for your feature, and you've actually solidified those interviews and times for it, go ahead and kind of consider these things. I created some tips for you all to help you to be as successful as possible for your interview. So it goes without saying that you should definitely state what the interview is, the purpose of it. Again, once more, when you're reaching out to the sources, please make sure that you state that you are an Ohio State student and that you're doing this for an academic assignment, and that if you do want to publish this somewhere, please make sure you tell that source that. Also, make sure that you're already doing research over this individual, especially if you're doing a feature article over a business, for instance. You don't want to come across as unprepared, as if you didn't do your homework. So do some research in advance, some background, or gather some background information so that you can kind of, use that time wisely that you have with the source. It also is beneficial if you send some questions out to the person that you're interviewing in advance so that they can feel a little more confident in the interview process. And what I mean by that is we discussed a couple class periods ago that sometimes people get really, really nervous when they're being interviewed for whatever reason, right? So you want to make sure that you're creating an environment where, both parties involved can answer in a way that's authentic, that there isn't any anxiety there, that people are going to answer in a way that's going to give you the most compelling information. The best reporters, in my opinion, are those that, of course, read, but also those who listen very well. The best communicators in general are ones that probably listen really, really strategically and intentionally. So the same applies for you all. Make observations in terms of how that interviewee is responding. If you're, conducting the interview over the phone, that is, make a mental note of how they responded, the tone of their voice, right? I know that latter part says take note of surroundings. Of course, I'm assuming many of you guys aren't going to be able to interview people in person because of the physical distancing order that we have in effect. But again, there are other things to consider when you're interviewing people that you can incorporate in your notes that have a lot to do with listening and just being aware of what's going on with that person. And then also make sure that you're asking questions that will, again, give you information that's going to make your article compelling, make your feature article stand out. I talked about this last class that although you're going to have a lot of direct quotes in this feature piece, make sure you only choose the ones that are going to be the most impactful and convey the news value of your story. So in terms of the specific questions that you will need, the specific amount of questions, you will need, I would say, about 7 to 10 questions, and many of them should be open-ended. Remember, this isn't, like a press release where you're, gathering information from online about an event or a major announcement. For many of you guys, you're probably going to start from scratch, right? So again, a lot of those questions should be open-ended so that you can actually have content to work with for this assignment. Any questions that you feel like might stir up some controversial issues or might be a little touchy, I would save those toward the end of the interview. You don't want to put your interviewee in an uncomfortable position, and not intentionally, right? But you want to make sure that you're starting off with easy questions, kind of, just to kind of develop that rapport with the interviewee, and then get into more of the nuances within the topic that you're discussing in your feature. If you are a little anxious about reaching out to people, you can certainly collaborate with your classmates in terms of they can listen in on this interview. Again, there's going to be some physical constraints in terms of physically bringing someone to the interview because we're probably not going to be conducting in-person interviews. But even something as simple as asking the interviewee whether or not, your classmate or your friend, whoever, can listen in on this interview so that everyone involved can be a little less nervous. And then again, going back to being strategic and almost a little picky about the information that you're choosing in this feature article, one really easy way to get that information is to ask the interviewee to elaborate on specific examples or experiences that help to essentially answer the question that you've asked them. That will go a long ways in terms of providing that content. And then just some final tips here. If for whatever reason there is something that the interviewee said that was a little confusing, or you might have thought that you misheard them, make sure that you clarify or ask for clarification of that person's response, because you don't want to assume that you understand and then you print something or you write something that isn't exactly accurate to what that interviewee said. And then follow-up questions are going to be your best friend in a feature article, again, because you have to gather a lot of information. So if there is something interesting or intriguing about that response, ask the interviewee to elaborate a little bit more on that. Why did that event take place, for example, or that situation take place? How do they feel about that particular situation that you're talking about in your interview? So really go for the emotional impact, right? Because again, a feature article is a human interest story. It's usually a human interest story. And then just some more, I guess you can say, obvious things, but again, it can be very easy to forget. Make sure you get that person's first and last name and then their title or how they're relevant to the story, I should say. It doesn't have to be a work title, just how they are relevant to the story. Now, if that person is not comfortable disclosing their real name because of, the topic that you're talking about, that's fine. You can make up a name for that individual. What you will need to do in your story, however, is put a little asterisk by the name that you are given that individual in place of their real name, so that I know that this person's name that you're using is a made-up name. And of course, make sure that you thank the people that you've interviewed for their time. And as a reminder, you're going to interview 2 people, minimum of 2 people. One is going to be the individual or the head of the organization that you're doing a profile over. And another one is going to be a person who maybe knows the individual that you're profiling, that you're highlighting in your story. So for example, if you wanted to highlight, again, a business owner, if you wanted to highlight a student athlete who is going through some type of serious illness, you might want to interview their teammate or their coach. So that's what I mean by secondary source compared to a primary source. Reach out to me if you still need further clarification on that as well. All right, and then now we're going to talk a little bit more about descriptive writing, because once more, that is a very distinct characteristic of feature writing. You don't always see highly descriptive writing in feature pieces, but you definitely see some sort of it, or some of it in some fashion or form. So what I mean by descriptive writing is tapping into those 5 senses. So the reader should be able to imagine what's going on. The reader should be able to, again, in quotes here, air quotes, smell what's going on. They should be able to visualize it in their head. They should be able to hear, right, some of the noises that you're describing, if that does apply to your article. So that's what I mean by descriptive, really making sure that you're immersing the reader into your storyline. So the phrase that I like to use in terms of when you're trying to think, did I actually accomplish this descriptive writing here, is painting the picture for the reader. So you need to make sure that, or you need to leave some type of impression, some mental impression in the minds of your readers. So here's a great example, and again, this is very similar to a couple lectures ago when I talked about descriptive writing. So the first passage that you see here, there's nothing wrong with it grammatically or in terms of punctuation or AP style, but it's more so, again, telling the reader what's going on or telling the reader about the scene. So it reads, the empty room smelled stale and lacked furniture and floor covering. The single wooden or window lacked curtains or blinds of any kind. So again, telling the reader what's going on. I'm not sure if I can necessarily really visualize it. And if I can, it's not as visual as perhaps what we might find in the second example, which reads, the room smelled of old cooking odors, cabbage, and mildew. So for those who, can recall the smell of cabbage and mildew, that's more of an impression as opposed to the empty room smelled stale. And then it goes on to read, a person's shoes could probably squeak sharply against the scuffed wood floors. So again, tapping into the hearing sense, right? So most people know how it sounds when someone's shoes, squeaks against, floors, especially floors that have been recently polished. And then the last sentence, a haze of dusty sunlight peeked from the one cobweb gritty window. So now I can really visualize that this room is really, really old, or it's probably old. So that's what I mean in terms of the second passage, descriptive writing, showing the reader what's going on, leaving a mental visual impression on your readers. So I have two sentences here that we were going to do for an in-class activity. What I mean by that is I was going to have you guys, if we were meeting in person, that is, I was going to have you guys change these two sentences so that they're more descriptive, or write a descriptive passage based upon those two sentences. But I'm going to pull some examples from my students last semester that did a really good job, again, in terms of turning this sentence or the sentences that you see here into more of a descriptive passage by, again, painting the picture. So for this first sentence here, many Ohio State students attend the career fair each semester. Again, telling the reader what's going on, not necessarily showing. So a better example of that in terms of showing the reader and painting the picture, engaging in descriptive writing for that first sentence. Students clad in black and white business suits, armed with portfolio pads and pens, await in line to receive their printed name cards from staff members behind a table wrapped in red cloth with the letters Career Fair on the front. Clasping the small white note card wrapped in plastic to their tie or collar, they enter the double rooms filled with anticipation and opportunity. Rows of tables lined with business cards and notepads, and employers standing readily in front greet students as they enter the yearly career event. Wow. So again, a lot more descriptive than what we saw here in the first sentence, right? So I can see what's going on. The student here, she described that's my dog. The suits of the students. All right, Diamond, I'm trying to record a lecture. Sit down. Sit down. And she also describes, you know, the cloth of the table of one of the recruiters, right? So you guys get the point here, what I'm looking for, using more adjectives to describe the scene. And then the last example here, I'm going to go back to that original sentence. So Mason knew at a very young age he wanted to be a doctor. And so once more, this is a more descriptive passage that helps to really tap into that second sentence there. So clutching his mother's hand at only 3 years old, Mason nervously winced at the needle, that should say, inch closer to his flesh. Piercing his skin, Mason let out a trembling cry. "All done," exclaimed Dr. Moore. "You handled that better than anyone else I've ever seen." And again, you guys can probably read the rest to yourselves. I like this example because it's more anecdotal in nature, and again, more descriptive as well. Now, a question that I received from students about this descriptive writing is they're wondering whether or not if they have to do this type of descriptive writing throughout the entire article. Absolutely not. So I think this is probably best for your feature leads at the very beginning, and maybe another, you know, really descriptive passage, maybe in the middle of your article or at the very end. But you don't have to do, you know, descriptive writing to this degree, at least, throughout the article. But you do have to do some type of, or you do have to write descriptively in some form or fashion throughout the article. The example that I always give is, making sure that you're paying close attention to your attributional phrases. So instead of saying the example that you see here, this student used the word exclaimed Dr. Moore instead of said Dr. Moore. So it adds more of a auditory, impact on the reader. So I can hear, an exclamation as opposed to just said. Adds more dynamic writing to it. Another example, Professor Roberts, instead of saying Professor Roberts said, you could say something like Professor Roberts said with a smile. So just very little things like that that you can do to make sure that you're engaging in descriptive writing throughout your feature article. So that is all that I have for you guys in terms of interviewing for your feature article and descriptive writing. Please let me know if you have any further questions about the assignment or this aspect of the assignment. Take care.